since my allotted time is only 15 minutes, I'll make 3 or 4 points in a rather schematic fashion. Now, what I want to do is to begin by providing the contemporary context and relevance for looking at the Kannada progressive tradition. Here, I have 2 objectives in this talk. One is to talk about what does it mean to be a progressive in this context of Karnataka, Kannada, and the other is how did we get there? How was this progressive tradition produced? The roadmap. I'll try to briefly describe some of that. Kannada is a South Indian language spoken in the state of Karnataka, which is now most widely known for having Bangalore as its capital, the Silicon Valley of India. Otherwise, Karnataka is some backwater, especially in academic circles. And the language itself is spoken by more than 60 million people, has a history of 2,000 years, so on and so forth. I want to submit that this progressive tradition, which has a history of nearly 6 decades, is in a crisis. And that crisis manifests itself in 2 forms. First, the radical possibilities, which were illuminated in progressive writings of the 1950s and 60s, have exhausted their energy and have exhausted their possibilities. They have now been reduced to utterly shallow caste-based identity politics, particularly to caste mobilization and distribution of public resources on caste basis. So there's a pressing need to rethink and reconstitute progressive politics. So that's one part of it, and some of us have recently established a magazine, a publishing house, and a digital venture that tries to address, that is trying to come to terms with this crisis in Kannada progressive circles. Secondly, progressive politics has also been under assault from the Hindu right for a while, and again this manifests in 2 different forms. The most dramatic manifestation, of course, has been in the form of killings of progressive activists and writers in Karnataka and Maharashtra. You know the names. While there are isolated events carried out by, while these are isolated events in many ways carried out by fringe elements, there is a more insidious unsettling of progressive thought. And this finds expression through the rejection of the need for any change, any radical transformation in Indian society, a dismissal of the progressive agenda itself, of progressive intellectuals and their thought, and they are characterized as Western agents, so on and so forth, completely unmoved from Indian society, Indian reality. Such dismissals have become quite pervasive now, and have perhaps been the greatest challenge for any radical transformative project in Karnataka, and I'd say in India today. So, what is threatening about a progressive tradition that is in need of reinvention anyway? Right? In the next 10 to 12 minutes, I'll try to outline 2 or 3 points specifically about the Kannada progressive tradition and its formation. In an essay on India, which is published in the collection Writing by Candlelight, British Marxist historian E.P. Thompson makes this really remarkable, interesting observation. He says that any thought which is being formulated anywhere in the world is being engaged by some Indian mind in some corner of India. Thompson makes that point to suggest the fecundity of thought experiments and connected social action unveiling in India constantly. This is a really remarkable essay that he wrote on his visit to India during emergency and his various conversations with radical activists and academics across the country. Really interesting essay. So I wanted to use this observation by Thompson to make a larger point that South Asian left isn't and hasn't ever been a monolith, and it has been, it's a banal point in a way, but it is important to recognize that there have been multiple influences, and progressive traditions have emerged in different regions at different time frames, and in some ways, the story that Rakshanda was telling is in some ways related to mine, but my story begins when her story ends. But in many ways, my story has an autonomous arc of its own, which is important to recognize. So, what I'm saying is, we have to be alert to the timelines and influences and so on, which seem to impact the making of progressive traditions across South Asia. So, quite differently from progressive traditions that Rakshanda talked about, Kannada progressive traditions emerged somewhat autonomously, I'd argue, in the 1950s, when the former, the story that Rakshanda narrated was in some kind of decline. In some ways, or in many ways, the influence of Progressive Writers Association, of IPTA, or even Orthodox Marxism was minimal on Kannada progressive tradition. There's an important historical event that I should flag as the backdrop for the story that I'm outlining, and that is the unification of Kannada-speaking regions, which were divided in at least 4 major administrative units of British India. And the reunification of these events, reunification of these regions itself was a radical project in many ways. So Kannada language itself could be empowered through this unification of different regions, when it can become, it can be transformed into the language of administration, of education, both in universities and schools. So once states are reorganized in India in the mid of the 1950s, and new linguistic states come into existence in 1956, in Karnataka, Kannada language itself was the instrument, it becomes the instrument for radical transformative politics, for decolonizing administration, for decolonizing educational institutions. And it doesn't necessarily succeed in this project entirely, but the beginnings are made, right? And that becomes the starting point. This new project then, right, it brings out greater institutions of egalitarianism by displacing English. Moving further, the ideological impetus for a Kannada progressive tradition came from Lohiite socialism. Right? Dr. Ram Manohar Lohia, well-known German-educated socialist, was active in Congress politics in the 1930s and 40s, and then becomes this great critique of Nehru in the 50s and moves away from Congress as well, established a socialist party. So it gained, this Lohiite socialism, his socialist party gained some electoral success from the very first general elections in 1952 in Karnataka, and continued to exist in the political margins until the early 1970s. In these 2 decades, I would argue, Lohia and his political associates wielded enormous influence on the making of Kannada progressive traditions. Karnataka, and more specifically Bangalore, did have more orthodox left presence, right, in the form of trade union activists who were very active in Bangalore, which was a reasonably important manufacturing center, and Communist Party was also present in some forms. But Lohia was the bigger draw in Karnataka. He visited frequently, took part in several famous agitations against landlords primarily, and the most famous of these was the Kagodu Satyagraha in 1951, which pitted contract farmers against landlords and launched a conversation about land reforms in a substantial way. Lohia also interacted closely with leading Kannada writers, many of whom translated his works, including Wheel of History, Interval During Politics, and there was also a very influential collection of his essays on caste system and Indian society, which was translated into Kannada in the mid-1960s and became a seminal text informing the understanding of Indian society for Kannada writers. Lohia, as Yogendra Yadav reminds us, was invested in a critique of European modernity as the national compass of radical politics, and was in search of an alternative kind of universalism, which wasn't located just in India, but in the global south. His critique of communism was in fact a critique of modern civilization, because he recognized communism shared capitalism's economic model, reliance on capital-intensive and technology-oriented development paths, which he saw as being unsuited for non-European world. So Lohia's political project was to replace modern civilization with an alternative universalism, one that is not derivative but new, one that wouldn't draw from either India's past or Europe's present. This he calls, as Yogendra Yadav suggests, socialism. This may not have been radically different from a democratic socialism. I mean, if you actually look at the ideals and the program as such. But Lohia's appeal was perhaps due to his analysis of Indian society, specifically for bringing caste to the forefront of his explanation of Indian society, analysis of Indian society. So Kannada progressives obtained even Gandhi through Lohia. There were many important Kannada writers of the 1960s who hadn't studied Gandhi on his own but received it through Lohia. And here, Lohia's critique of modern civilization, which is in some ways a very refined analysis, but in some ways building on Gandhi's Hind Swaraj, the arguments that Gandhi makes in Hind Swaraj. So even Gandhi is someone that comes through Lohia to Karnataka. And this is openly admitted by many leading writers of the 1960s in Karnataka. My final point then, drawing on this situating of Lohia as the key figure, is to talk about the agenda that emerged in the 1950s and 60s through Lohia-inspired political activism and literary production. As I noted above, the centrality of Kannada for creating a new vision for the future was emphatically made. By 1960s, Kannada became the language of university education because Kannada writers had begun to take charge of university education. They were translating Western classics into Kannada, getting textbooks written in Kannada, and there was this vision of making Kannada into a language of knowledge, right? Both production of knowledge as well as transmission of knowledge. The question of land was also pushed to the forefront, and Socialist Party legislators, especially Gopal Gowda, who was the preeminent political figure, follower of Lohia, spoke in the Legislative Assembly about the need for land reforms, and their interventions informed the earliest land reform bill passed by Karnataka legislature in 1961. But a more robust bill was introduced and it was implemented in the 1970s. The third pillar of this progressive agenda, apart from Kannada and land reforms, was what Lohia himself called Jati Vinasha, annihilation of caste, if we were to use the phrase by Ambedkar. But the arguments made by Lohia himself and his followers are quite different from the arguments that Ambedkar makes. Here, what the Lohia socialists argue is for intercaste marriage as opposed to completely exiting Hinduism, exiting caste system itself. Southern Karnataka, Mysore region had already witnessed a robust anti-Brahmin movement throughout the early 20th century, which not only had empowered Shudras, the fourth Varna of Indian caste hierarchy, but they had also gotten special affirmative action privileges by the early 1920s. So socialists build on this, on these instruments which had already been created to move towards an egalitarian society. And so, as I was saying earlier, they weren't arguing exiting Hinduism, exiting caste system per se, but bringing about equality through various measures within the caste system. It was somewhat of a confused model in some ways, but I want to suggest that there is a different vision of annihilation of caste here. So this took the form of protesting against traditional institutions such as mathas and temples, breaking caste taboos, by explicitly promoting intercaste marriages, which became an important instrument actually for socialists. Kannada literature actually produced several classics The most important of them being, U.R. Anantmurthy Samskara. There are several stories by Purnachandra Tejasvi and P. Lankesh, who wrote a very acclaimed play called Sankranti, all of which were arguing for, to use this nice phrase by D.R. Nagaraj, the late cultural critic, sexual contact between castes. And breaking down, there were other arguments made by these progressive writers like U.R. Anantmurthy about breaking down, temples or promoting temple entry in novels like Bharati Pura and so on. And then, as I said, there was also affirmative programs for backward caste, which became an important programmatic issue for the socialists. The final pillar for this, agenda that socialists offered was the decentralization of power, promoting Panchayat Raj institutions. This was something that Gandhi was quite passionate about in his conception of the state, and socialists entirely adopted that and used that. So there's a kind of Gandhian left being produced through this progressive intervention, which becomes influential, which I would say sets the agenda for politics from the 1970s onwards. So that consensus exists from 1970s to early 2000s, and in these 30 years, politics of Karnataka, regardless of who is in power, was basically about executing all these progressive objectives that socialists of the 1950s and 60s had put in place, right? And so when Devaraj Aras, who was this backward class chief minister, instituted land reforms or reservations for affirmative action for backward classes, all that was basically an implementation by a centrist political party of an agenda that was created by socialists. And in the 1980s, when decentralization of power and new Panchayat Raj institutions were instituted by another centrist party government, Ramakrishna Hegde-led Janata Party, you have the same, another facet of that agenda being implemented. So these four arguments made and reproduced, these four pillars were reproduced in Kannada literature, as well as two important social movements that emerged in the 1970s and 80s, which were again inspired by Lohia-led activists. And it is here that cultural production and politics come together, right? So you have literary activism as well as farmers movement and Dalit movement coalescing, producing new kind of art, taking us back to some of the cultural production, literary production that Rachanda was talking about. But all of that is basically around these four ideas: centrality of Kannada, land reforms, breaking down caste barriers, and then decentralization of power. So this becomes the focus for Kannada progressive tradition. Now, speaking of a crisis, as Karnataka changes, as Bangalore becomes this different kind of place, right, that puts the pressure on this old progressive consensus. And you also have the challenges thrown up by the Hindu right. And so this is the historical occasion in some ways for us to start a new conversation about what does it mean to be a progressive now? What are the different kinds of theoretical tools that we require in order to rethink a new agenda? How do we think about, how do we come up with new egalitarian public policy measures, given that we're somewhat wedded to a democratic setup, a representative democratic setup? So let me stop here, and thanks again for listening patiently.